I think manual gearbox oil might be seen as a lifetime product, but that might mean 100,000 miles to a car manufacturer. So if your car has high miles and you fancy changing it, here is how to do it. Step 1 is warm up the gearbox oil. So it's another overcast day in Paris. So I'm going to take the car past Crossgate's garage and on to Pennybont. So a little bit further than normal because the gearbox oil will probably be a bit slower to warm up. So I've taken it a bit longer. So we're nearly up to Pennybont now, and then I'll turn the car around and head back home. So I won't hang around, I'll get the car straight into the garage because there's quite a few things to do and I'd like the oil as warm as possible while I'm trying to drain it. It's worth knowing in advance what transmission you have. In my model of car it's the PK4, and I understand that to take 2.4 litres of TRP 75W/80W gear oil, but Haynes says 2.2 litres. PK6 is down as 2.5 litres, but Haynes has it as 2.2 litres, so again, not sure exactly who's right. There is also the JH3 and JR5 transmissions, which use TRJ 75W/80W gear oil. The JH3 uses 2.8 litres and the JR5 2.5 litres. Here's an example of where the gearbox number is on my gearbox, which is the PK4. Other than a trolley jack and axle stands, you will need the following for the Renault Laguna too: 10mm and 17mm sockets for the undertray and road wheel, an 8mm square drive for the gearbox drain plug, oil catch pan that can hold say 5 litres, a torque wrench to torque 18 Nm or 22 Nm on the GH3 and JR5 gearboxes, 3 litres of TRP 75W/80W gear oil in my case, an interior trim tool for plastic covers, and a pressure type filling tool is very handy like the Sealey VS70095. You'll need at least 3 litres of gearbox oil, and that normally comes in 1 litre containers because it's not sold in large quantities. If you're taking the road wheel off, you'll obviously need a breaker bar and a 17mm socket for the wheel nuts, and obviously a torque wrench to do them back up. Then you'll need the 10mm socket to undo all the bolts on the undertray. Once the undertray is removed, we'll need the 8mm square drive, which is what fits the gearbox drain plug. And then we'll need our torque wrench to torque the sump plug to the correct level. A couple of trim removing tools is useful for the wheel arch plastic liner. Now I used a pressure vessel to put the gearbox oil back in, which made life considerably easier. Though the downside is it would add extra cost to the job, so unless you were going to use it on a regular basis, it may not be worth getting. We now need to jack the car up and place on axle stands, but first I'm going to break the 5-wheel bolts loose on the near side wheel, as I will be taking the road wheel off to show the gearbox filler plug more clearly in this video. So I'm just going to break these 5 bolts loose on the near side wheel and line up trolley jack number 1 under the passenger side. I'll jack that up a little bit and then go around to the driver's side and repeat the process again. Now I'll show you where the head of the jack should be, and it should be here, just underneath there. So always make sure you jack on the correct point, otherwise you do risk damaging the seal. So I'll take this side up a bit, then pop round, do the same again, always trying to keep the car reasonably level without it being too off balance. Always make safe the car by using axle stands. So even with 2 hydraulic jacks supporting the car, it's still not worth the risk of going underneath the car which isn't supported with axle stands. So I lower the car onto the axle stands and I still leave the jacks in place. Now remove the plastic undertray. This is held in place by 8 bolts and requires a 10mm socket to undo them. Here's a photo to show the 8 bolts. So this under tray is held on with 8 bolts and requires the 10mm socket to undo them. I must say, removing this under tray can be somewhat of a drag every time you want to work underneath the car, like doing an oil change and things. Though for safety reasons it's probably quite useful, because if there is any oil leaks, the oil should stay on this tray rather than going onto the road surface, where it obviously would present a slip hazard to motorcyclists and things like that. So now the last bolt's just coming out. So off comes the tray once again. Now drain the oil using the 8mm square drive. And here's a photo to show the gearbox drain plug in red. So here we use our 8mm square drive on a short breaker bar. Now in hindsight, probably would have been a bad idea to actually have cleaned around the area of this drain plug, just to get rid of any grit and stuff. But obviously I didn't do that, but I would probably advise doing that. So here it comes. So as I undo the plug, I push upwards, feel for the end of that thread, feel for the click, and then I can brace myself and remove the plug and tool in one go, like now. There we are. So we'll just leave that to drain now, give that a good while. So I'll speed this part up. So there we go. That oil actually is quite clean because it was actually changed last year. So there we are. So it's looking like about 2.5 litres has come out. Now I'm going to wipe around the edge. Like I said, probably better to have wiped at the beginning. Replace the sump plug, ideally with a new copper washer, and tighten to 18 Nm for the PK4 and PK6 transmissions and 22 Nm for the JH3 and JR5 models. So we can now replace the sump plug. Now also note this copper washer I'm showing, that should be replaced, because each time you tighten it up it does conform to create the seal. So really that should be replaced. So I'm going to pop that in, and then obviously we need to torque that to 18 Nm in my case with the PK4 gearbox. Though on the other gearboxes it could be 22 Nm. So this is where things can get a bit complicated. The car should now be lowered onto a level surface and the oil refilled through the filler hole on the side of the transmission till excess oil flows back out, and then the filler plug screwed back in. To show the filler hole in more detail, I will remove the road wheel and fill with a pre-measured amount of oil instead. So I'm just going to remove this near side wheel, and this is why I cracked the bolts earlier on with the car on the ground. So it was easy to take this wheel off. Using the trim removing tools, we can now remove the black plastic cover to reveal the white filler plug that can be unscrewed by hand. Now this is where the trim removing tools come in. Now this part's easy enough, one there, and then it pops on to this metal bar. Again, not a problem there. But now there's part of the plastic goes forward to the front of the car, so you've got to undo the part that's not quite as accessible now towards the front of the car. So it's a shame it just doesn't clip off from that point. As you can see, I'm now working under the front, just taking out one of the black grommets, and there's another one that goes sideways. And now we can get it out. So you'll be able to see the filler plug now. There it is. I'll mark that in red. There we go. Now that just undoes with your hand, so no tools needed here. Just turn to the left and simply unwind. And that's your filler hole. I've measured the oil coming out and it appears to be 2.5 litres, so that seems to go along the lines of what Renault said, which was 2.4 litres. For simplicity, I will add 2.5 litres to my pressure filler, and allowing for some oil being left in the tool, the gearbox should receive the correct amount of 2.4 litres. So I'm going to just check the measure of the amount of oil that actually came out of the gearbox, and it's 2.5 litres, so that's what I'll put back in. Now I'm going to be using one of these Sealey pressure transmission filling devices or tools, which does make life a lot easier, because instead of holding pipes into that gearbox hole and trying to squeeze the bottle and things like that, with this you literally just fill up with the oil you need, seal it up, pump it, and then you just open the tap once the tube's inside the gearbox, and it simply dispenses all the oil straight in there, so there's no mess, no wastage. Now to pump the 2.4 litres of oil in. So technically you should actually have the car on the flat surface with the wheels on, presumably. And to fill this until the oil starts to come back out of the hole, then you know it's at the maximum level. Now that would obviously be quite tricky to do, so I am somewhat cheating here by just pumping in a predetermined amount back into the gearbox. This is probably where, if you had a 4-post lift in a full garage, this sort of job would obviously be a lot easier and more accurate, because you could remove all this, keep the wheels on, and still gain access to the bottom of the car. Or unless you had one of those old pits, didn't they? So you could go underneath the car in a pit. But anyway, so that's my oil put back in, 2.5 litres. So I'll just put the cap back on and tighten that. Doesn't need to be too tight, otherwise you might risk breaking the plastic and you'd have to get another plug. Okay, so the oil's back in there. Now to replace the plastic cover. So here's a photo of the cover and the 3 plastic fixtures. So like I say, it's somewhat awkward. You need to poke it up there. Like I say, you can see the front part that has to tuck in under the front. I probably should have brought that panel down that I'm holding now. That would have made life a little bit easier, but I thought I could try and cut some corners there. Probably didn't really help. So the cover's now back on. Pop that plastic fixture in, and that's that panel on. Then the road wheel. So get the front wheel back on now. I'll line up the hub so it's at the 12 o'clock position, and then the top bolt will be at 12 o'clock as well on the wheel. That lines up. So we just need to do this hand tight, because we will need to go over it with a torque wrench once the car's back on the ground. Now replace the undertray. So back to the undertray again. So lift that up, hook it under at the front. I do actually have 2 bolts missing at the front there. So although it's 8 bolts, I've only got 6 to put in. And the nuts on the back of these are riv nuts. So they sometimes fail or keep spinning round and around. So you have to sort of cut them out or break them out and put a new riv nut in But this one seems to have the 2 bolts are missing completely. So nearly done that. And then onto the last bolt. There we go. So that's that back on. So just raise the car slightly to get it off the axle stands, and then quick as you can get the axle stands out, because it is only being held with the jacks. And then we can lower it back down. When you lower it down, make sure your camera's not near the front of the car, because it then hits your camera. Not good. Don't forget to torque the road wheel bolts to 105 Newton meters if you removed the road wheel. Easy to overlook torquing the road wheel, but make sure you do. Here are some detailed photographs with labels to help with identifying all the visible parts. I will put them on for only 4 seconds each, with the idea that you can pause them for detailed viewing. Thank you for watching, and hope this helped other home mechanics out.